Welcome or welcome back to my channel, guys. My name is Claudia, I'm 22, and here on my channel we talk all things personal finance, especially for those of us in our early 20s that want to set us up to have an amazing life later without worrying about finances. So be sure to subscribe. Today, as you would have seen by the title, we're going to be doing a comparison video between who I think are probably the two biggest phenomenons around personal finance, some of the biggest anyway, and that would be Dave Ramsey as well as the Barefoot Investor. So Dave Ramsey, if you don't know, is you probably know if you clicked on this video, is a massive personal finance guru over in the US, and the Barefoot Investor wrote more so just a book. I don't think he has a whole brand around it as much as Dave, called the Barefoot Investor. His name is Scott Pape, but he kind of just goes by the Barefoot Investor here in Australia, and he's an Australian personal finance guru. There's quite a big difference in their mentalities, which just comes from being, I think, American and Australian. But what I'm going to do today is kind of just break down the basics of how they differ in their personal finance steps. I actually found it quite interesting to go through and do this comparison, to sit down and flip through this again, and knowing more of what I do about personal finance, flipping through this again and kind of reopening my eyes to what he talks about in this book and different things, which I would love to do another in-depth thoughts on both of these. If you're interested in that, drop me a comment, because this is just kind of going to be breaking down the steps and kind of what they talk about on a very basic level, not in-depth, pulling this apart. Is his advice any good? It's just kind of going to be comparing the two's advice. But yeah, if you'd love to see an in-depth review of the Barefoot Investor or an in-depth review of Dave Ramsey, would love to do those for you, because I just think it's so... Personal finance can differ so much because it is personal, but it's just so interesting. Anyways, I'm going to split this video up kind of into three different sections where I talk about their individual steps, so Dave Ramsey's baby steps versus the Barefoot steps, and then we'll talk about their budget percentages and see how they differ, how similar they are, and then just a couple other things that I found while comparing the two that I want to talk about at the end. So I will have chapters for all of that, so you can kind of click and go between if there's something you really just want to know about. But let's just get into the individual steps. I did want to talk a little bit, before I got into the steps, about their different backgrounds and their different stories leading up to their kind of financial aha moment. For Dave Ramsey, it was about bankruptcy, so it was about spending more than what he had, and that all came to a head and he went bankrupt. Whereas for the Barefoot Investor, it was more about he actually lost his house. I believe, I'm not sure, it doesn't say in the book, I don't think, but I think it was the Victorian bushfires, but he lost his house and his farm to bushfires. So he lost all of his stuff, all of everything, and his house along with it. And it was just him, his wife, and his baby son, I believe at the time, that then had to start over again. So I think that's a kind of gives you a little bit about their mentalities going into this. We're looking at somebody who's talking about scaling back their spending compared to somebody who's building up from nothing. So I think that kind of, knowing that, you will see kind of some different things in their steps, which I think make more sense knowing that information, if that makes any sense. Now let's get into the different steps. I'm gonna pop this graphic up on the screen for you, which is the steps next to each other, and you'll see that they're kind of a little bit skewed because I kind of wanted to pop them where they closest, I kind of staggered them a bit. You'll see as I go through it. Basically, the Barefoot Investor has 9 steps, whereas Dave has 7. So you'll see where there's a bit of gaps because I was trying to line it up as best as I thought. We're going to break it down now and go through the individual ones. So for the first Barefoot step, we have setting up your Barefoot date nights. And I have nothing here for Dave Ramsey because I feel like there wasn't something comparable as far as the steps. I feel like Dave Ramsey's first step goes better with Barefoot Investor's second step, setting up your Barefoot date night. So this is where he talks about getting on the same page with your partner, going out, spending more money, which is a bit interesting, and setting up kind of the basics of your finance. So he breaks it down into your first 5, which are weekly, which are your, sorry, I'm like checking my notes. So it's getting your bank accounts on the right page, having them with no fees, superannuation, insurance, your serviette strategy as he calls it, which is your budget, and then your debt. So he kind of goes over setting that up and getting all of those things kind of on the right page before you dive too deep into your kind of journey, your financial journey. Is getting on the same page, having these chats about finances, and he really talks about eliminating some of those fees that come with bank accounts, insurances, and superannuation. There's a lot of info there about different scripts and different action steps you can take to tackle those things and fix those things. He also gives you point by point what he uses. So he talks about the super fund he uses, he talks about the bank accounts he uses, he talks about insurance and all the insurances you need. He's very cut and dry about, like, if you want to do it how I did it, this is how I did it. It's not like, do your research. Obviously you need to do your research, but it's not just like, you need insurance, you should have no bank fees. Like, he tells you where to go, he tells you where's the best place. And it's so funny working in retail in Australia, because you see everybody with the Barefoot Investor cards and they've got their splurge written on them and everything, which we'll get to in a minute, but it's so funny to see how this kind of phenomenon has taken on for so many people. Anyways, I'm getting off track. But that's kind of his first, is to like set up your barefoot date nights, which while they move through all the different steps, he makes a point of making that one step, which I kind of think is super important, which is why I wanted to kind of note that at the top, in that Dave Ramsey doesn't really have anything next to that. Anyways, I'm trying not to like give my opinion too much and be like, because at the end of the day, like, I don't follow either one of these point by point. So I don't want to be like, oh, this is the one you should use. I'm just trying to lay it out and not be too opinionated, but I think it'll be quite clear which one I think is better at the end. So moving on to number 2, or number 1 for Dave Ramsey. Baby step number 1 is to save $1,000, which is your starter emergency fund, just to get you through to not go back into debt. I mean, like, while getting out of debt just kind of keeps you safe-ish for any mild emergency. I think we've seen after 2020 that most people don't agree that this is enough while you're paying down debt and doing other things, but that's baby step 1, save $1,000 fast for your emergency one, compared to barefoot step number 2, which is to set up your buckets, which is blow, mojo, and grow. I think this is more of a mental thing, because you're not necessarily setting anything up here, I guess, except your mojo, which is his equivalent to an emergency fund, and he recommends putting $2,000 in there and doing that again as quickly as you can, selling everything, picking up odd jobs, just getting $2,000 in an account that is not linked to your main expenses or savings accounts, which is separate to your, I guess, your blow bucket, which I guess is the only really thing that you set up as far as buckets, but your grow bucket is your superannuation. So I guess you do set those up in that you choose your super fund, but it's not like saying you've got 3 different bank accounts. He breaks down your bank accounts further in your blow bucket, which sounds really weird to say, but that's his step number 2, is to set up your buckets and get your mojo full, which is $2,000 compared to Dave Ramsey's $1,000. Baby step number 3 and Barefoot Investor step number 3 are very similar. They are to pay down your debts. So for Dave Ramsey, it is the debt snowball, and for Barefoot Investor, it is the domino your debts, he calls it. So they're both just different analogies for putting the smallest debt first and using that momentum, that psychological aspect of paying down debt, as well as having those payments roll into each other to create a knock-on effect or a snowball effect for paying down debt. Neither of them say that paying off the highest interest is the most important. I will just comment, both of them talk about not paying down the house yet, but also just because we're in Australia, the Barefoot Investor talks about not paying your student loans for the same reason that I talked about in my debt-free video, is you pay your loan fees when you sign the fee for the loan. They've added on whatever that loan fee is for you, depending on your situation and whatever. and there is no interest on those. You don't start paying them back till you've made the minimum income amount for that financial year. And if you are not paying them back, they are just indexed to keep up with inflation. Last year they were indexed at 1.8%. The year that he wrote this, it was 1.5%, which is about 3 years ago. So it's really, if you've got a chunk of money sitting there and you think, should I pay down this or invest, you're going to have a better rate of return on your investment. So that's why he recommends just leaving that. Also in Australia, these debts die with you. So in the event that you were never a high income earner, then they will just die with you. I really wonder what Dave Ramsey would say to that if that was the situation in America. Like, it's interest and it's indexed annually at like the lowest interest rate any loan ever has, unless it's zero. I'm really curious to what he would say about that, because he's very against any kind of debt. But that's just one of those things where you never really know, because the systems are just so different, which we are so lucky to have that in Australia. Anyways, moving on, it was just a little side note just to talk about that, because he does talk about paying down everything but the house and the student loans, and Dave talks about paying down everything but the house, because for most in America, their biggest loans are their student loans. This one here I kind of have jumped in the middle because it feels like an extra step he's put in there, and that is to buy your house. So I think this extra step comes from the fact that he lost his. He was more talking about establishing that wealth and starting, I guess, from the bottom again, which is, I think, why it's so much more relatable to so many more people here, especially like me, because it talks about saving that deposit for the house, increasing your income to do that, all those things. And it's that mentality of plant, grow, harvest, which is his kind of mentality. Whereas I feel like Dave's is more about paying down what you've already spent and kind of reversing, if that makes any sense. Whereas the Barefoot is about like what you're doing next. I don't know if that makes any sense. But that's that extra step he's got there about to buy your house. If you're already in that situation where you've bought a house, this is the step that's skipped anyway. So I kind of didn't put a Dave step next to it, because I felt like the Dave steps worked better further down. Baby step number 3 for Dave Ramsey, and in Barefoot Investor step 5. So 3 for Dave Ramsey is to save 3 to 6 months in your emergency fund. So you've got rid of your debts. Now it's time to kick Murphy out and be set up with your emergency fund to tackle the next things, because that's going to keep you safe for the future. And then on the Barefoot Investor side, he's talked about now you increase your super contributions, which are your retirement contributions, to 15%, which for us in Australia, that's actually only taking 5% of your take-home pay and putting that to your super, because our employers have to contribute 9.5% of our wages to our super. It's already skimmed off the top. We never kind of get that money. It's just to our super. Step number 6 for Barefoot Investor and step number 4 for Dave Ramsey, we actually have it flipped. Step number 6 for the Barefoot Investor is to boost your mojo to 3 months, which again, that's what he calls his emergency fund. He's only requesting that you boost it up to 3 months, that is enough. Whether he would give different advice now in the world that we live in, I don't know. And then on the flip side, Dave Ramsey is invest 15% for retirement. So that is kind of interesting how they've flipped those other 2 ways. I don't know if there's any sort of reason behind that, why one is more important than the other. I think most people will agree that you should be doing those things simultaneously all the time, all the way through your jet journey. Most other personal finance people talk about on YouTube that they continued saving for retirement during their debt. They had the 3 to 6 month emergency fund before they started their jet journey. So I think this is more just kind of personal to where you feel comfortable doing it. I just thought it was interesting that those were flipped, and that the Barefoot Investor feels like only having 3 months of expenses is enough, which I think is interesting considering where he came from, in that he lost his entire house and he lost everything, and that he feels like 3 months is enough. I don't know, I just find that interesting. So on to the next one. I've totally lost where we are, but I think we're on baby step number 5. I don't know where we are on Barefoot Investor. Baby step number 5 is to save for college versus paying off your home loan. He calls it getting the bank off your back. So this is where you pay off the house that you own. And I find it interesting that Save for College came before paying off your house. That is one of those things that I think the government, the economy kind of decides for you. Our student loans here, again, like I said, are quite, while they're still expensive, it's a very different situation. The debt doesn't accrue interest, and you don't have to pay it back straight away if you're not making money straight away. All of these things that set kids up to be able to take out student loans in a more manageable way. So it's less of the responsibility of the parent, it's more just you will kind of do it yourself. I don't know, is that making any sense? Whereas in America, student loans are a massive thing, and a lot of the time it does fall on the parent to kind of come up with some money for college. That's a very, I don't know, maybe if that's just what I'm seeing from TV and movies and stuff, but it's a very different situation as far as college or university goes. So I understand why the Barefoot Investor doesn't really talk about saving for kids' college or school. He does talk about being prepared for kids and school, especially if you want to send your kids to private school and things like that, and working that out early and planning for that, but it's not like one of his foundational steps. So that's interesting. Which brings us on to baby step number 6, and the equivalent for Barefoot Investor, which is pay off the house for Dave Ramsey and then nail your retirement number for the Barefoot Investor. So now he's saying, like, kick it, you've paid off your house, you've got everything done, it's time to kick up and make sure you are set for retirement, versus Dave, who's still at paying off the house because they saved for college first. I find it interesting that the Barefoot Investor came back to retirement and like re-looking at your numbers, making sure you're making enough for retirement, because one of his main things is you don't need to retire with $1 million, and your number is a lot lower, mostly because he talks about the fact that you'll never really quit working and you'll have money coming in even from some side gig, some random thing that you do, because it's not in our nature to just completely not work. And he also talks about living off the pension. I have thoughts about that. I'm not going to go into it too much, but his retirement number is a lot lower than that of Dave Ramsey. So he recommends $250,000 in your nest egg for retirement. If you're a couple, $170,000 if you're a single, whereas Dave uses, I believe it's like, is it the 4% rule? Also, if you were living off $40,000, your retirement number would be $500,000. So it depends on what you live off of. Whereas the Barefoot Investor really does work on you only taking out a very small amount of that because you're living off the government pension, which he believes will not go away for many years. Just stating the facts there, just stating what they've put. Last step for both of them, so this is baby step number 7 and Barefoot Investor step number 9, and that is to build wealth and give and leave a legacy. So this both comes down to the same point of you've got everything now, you've covered your bases, and it's time to grow and pass that on to somebody else. Dave very much focuses, which we'll talk about again in his percentages, about giving to other people and giving to charities and tithing and doing all the things, whereas Barefoot Investor hasn't really talked about giving, but he has talked about leaving a legacy, so passing that on to other people. They both kind of get to this point of you are set, it's time to just cruise and pass that on to others. And that's kind of the breakdown of the baby steps there. If there's anything that I maybe didn't talk about enough or you'd want more on, definitely drop a comment and I can reply. Now let's move on to how they budget as well as their budgeting percentages. So Dave tackles budgeting with a zero-based budget. So that gives giving every dollar a number and a place to go and a job, and kind of having zero left at the end. Whereas the Barefoot Investor works off of percentages. So percentages set your bounds and then you can do whatever you want with the money that way. So he doesn't really say you need an Excel spreadsheet. Automate it, make it simple. He doesn't stress the point of like you need a budget tracking every single thing. Now let's go into their expenses. The biggest one we have housing. Dave Ramsey recommends 25% of your take-home pay. Barefoot Investor recommends 30%, and we have utilities. They both say about 5 to 10%. Transport, Dave Ramsey has it set at 10, whereas Barefoot Investor has it at 5 to 10%. Insurance for Dave Ramsey is 10 to 25%, which understandably they have things like health insurance and other insurances that might be more important, whereas here we have a very good healthcare system, so insurance is not necessarily as big of an expense. So insurance is actually at 5%. Food is 10 to 15% for Dave Ramsey and 5 to 10% for Barefoot Investor. I keep forgetting who I'm talking about. This is where they kind of really start to differ. The Barefoot Investor talks about having a splurge account, so you put 10% there for short-term spending, so just whatever you want. Coffee, clothes, shoes, lunches out. Smile, which is your long-term spending, so things like weddings, vacations, things that make you happy but aren't necessarily big major financial goals and milestones. Then you have 20% for your fire extinguisher, which is the money you use to pay down debt, to save for your house, to pay off your house, and then eventually maybe invest it to kind of grow your nest egg if you don't have enough in retirement, if you didn't start early enough. Whereas Dave just continues to break it down into 5 to 10% for miscellaneous, recreation 5 to 10%, personal spending 5 to 10%, and then he also has giving at 10% and savings at 10%. As far as dividing this all up, Dave Ramsey talks about the cash envelope system and putting your money into cash envelopes, and once the envelope's empty, you're done. You don't steal from others. It's a good way to separate out your money. Also the psychological aspect of paying with cash, overpaying with a credit or a debit card, whereas the Barefoot Investor talks about having multiple bank accounts. In the first Barefoot Date Night, he talks about setting up 4 bank accounts, which this does not include your Mojo. Your Mojo's in a separate account, but you have 2 debit cards, which one is for daily expenses and one is for your splurge, and then you have 2 savings, one for your Smile, one for your fire extinguisher. So that's kind of how he sets that up. I've been talking for ages now, so let's just get into the different little things I found while rereading the books that I just think are interesting. Most of them are quite similar for the two, but just some interesting points. So as far as housing, they both recommend having a 20% deposit to avoid paying private mortgage insurance, mortgage lender's insurance, something along those lines. I think it's different in America as it is here, but it's essentially the same thing. It's paying insurance on your loan because you're a risk because you didn't put as much down on your deposit. Barefoot Investor also talks about, when looking at how much house you can afford, to think about, are you eventually going to go back to one income? Is this going to be your income when you have kids? How is that going to work? Should you be budgeting for a smaller house so that you have kind of growing room? So I thought that was interesting. He really kind of thinks ahead. Now, to be saying that, I didn't read through Dave as much as I read through Barefoot Investor again. If there's somewhere where he says that, I'm sorry I didn't mention it. Cars. They both agree you should buy cars with cash, and they pretty much both agree that used is the better term. Barefoot Investor recommends half of your annual salary is how much your car should cost. So I mean, if you're making a crap ton of money and you want to buy a new car, then I feel like he's more just like, be realistic about what you are spending, whereas Dave's like, buy used, buying new is a waste of money. Now, this is another interesting point that I did want to bring up. Because the Barefoot Investor has what he calls the fire extinguisher fund, so he's budgeted in his debt payoff and his savings and his house deposits and all those things. He's also budgeted in the fun things. He really doesn't, he's not the kind of person who's like, you can't have your iced coffee, you can't have your avocado toast. He's very much like, you have your splurge account, that's what it's for, spend it on whatever you want. Whereas I feel like Dave Ramsey has that mentality of nothing that is not a necessity is a waste of money, because you're spending money that you shouldn't be spending because you need to pay back money you've already spent. Which I do understand that, but also is that it's like going on a really restrictive diet. Is that really going to help you in the long run? Probably not. My opinions are starting to come out the longer this video goes on. So that's pretty much everything that I found while going through the books again this time to compare in the video. Like I said, I'm happy to do like a part 2 and go deeper into this and break down some more stuff, or just do like separate reviews on the Barefoot Investor and Dave Ramsey, break down their exact thing. Do I agree with it? How does it compare to what I'm doing? I feel like that would be really, really interesting. So if you want to see one of those, drop a comment down below. I'd also really love if you could give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it, if you found it informative in any way. I would love for you to give the thumbs up, and if you like what I'm putting out as far as my finance videos, I'd love if you could subscribe to the channel, join the fam, keep learning. I've got some really, really cool videos coming up which I've been doing a lot of like research and getting my facts right about. Yeah, I'm so excited for all those to come, so be sure to subscribe to my channel. I'd love to have you here. Great feeling every time I get a new subscriber, so be part of the fam, make me happy, and I will see you guys all in next week's video. Thanks so much for watching. Bye.
When we wake, hear the birds and see the sun. Side by side our fears are done. All the good times just begun.